lychee fruits have evidently been used in many cultures for the folk medicine treatment of everything from farts to testicular swelling. Yeah, but arsenic, mercury, and lead are also included in many traditional remedies, so how much is that really telling us? But lychees have been apparently shown to exhibit numerous health benefits. Yeah, but they cite studies like this. The protective effect of a lychee flower extract on cardiovascular health in a high-fat fed hamster. What are you supposed to do with that? You don't even eat the flowers. Oh, and you're not a hamster. Hard to argue with this, though. A flavor that's sweet, fragrant, and delicious, which is why I love them so much. But then I saw papers like this. A child-killing toxin emerges from shadows? Scientists link mystery deaths to the consumption of lychees. In Vietnam, it was called nightmare encephalitis, unexplained outbreaks in children coinciding with lychee harvesting. Children go to bed fine, but wake up the next morning seriously ill with brain function derangement and seizures, or don't wake up at all. Same thing in India, killing up to nearly 2 out of 3 kids affected in some places. And we're talking thousands of kids, becoming one of the most pressing public health emergencies in the country. It was evidently one of the 3 long-standing mystery diseases on Wikipedia, remaining a mystery for more than 2 decades. All clinical samples were negative for known brain viruses, so some investigators thought it was caused by some unknown virus. Others thought it might have been the pesticides used in the orchards. All we knew is it seemed to coincide with the lychee harvest. So maybe the fruit was attracting fruit bats, and then the mosquitoes were transferring some new virus from bats to people. Okay, but then why would toddlers be spared? Mosquitoes bite infants too. So maybe kids were swapping spit with the fruit bats, eating half-eaten fruit? Or maybe it was just because it was summertime and they were all just getting heat stroke? Okay, then why wasn't the heat or pesticides affecting adults? One of the clues that finally helped investigators tease out the mystery was that the children consistently had low blood sugar, in some cases fatally low blood sugars. That kind of sounds like Jamaican vomiting sickness. Perfectly well when they went to bed, but by the next morning sick, then unconscious, and then both dead within 48 hours. All thanks to the unripe ackee fruit, which contains a toxin known as hypoglycin that prevents your liver from churning out blood sugar all night long to keep your brain alive while you sleep. And ackee is a member of the soapberry family, just like lychees. Aha! But Muzafarfar is a leading lychee producer, and experts at the National Lychee Center claimed they completely refuted the lychee link, but independent researchers found it. Lychee fruit contains methylene cyclopropylglycine, aka the exact same hypoglycin toxin. So, in the setting of malnourished children who already start out with depleted energy stores in their livers due to going to bed hungry and general malnutrition, low blood sugar sets in, and due to the excessive lychee consumption, the production of new energy is blocked, and the trouble starts. It's a social tragedy that children are dying in the 21st century due to low blood sugar, which could be easily corrected. And just as tragic that hungry children are forced to binge on lychees falling on the ground to get a meal. It's like something out of the Grapes of Wrath. The happy ending, though, is that rather than just focusing on better treatments, public health workers sought instead to treat the cause by educating folks that no child should go to bed at night without eating a cooked meal, and for parents to restrict children eating lychees in the evening to none or very few. And thankfully, by applying these recommendations, the disease incidence has been dramatically reduced. In hindsight, it appears China was already warning citizens about the dangers of lychees a decade earlier, but word had apparently just not gotten around. What are the implications in the West? In the US, the FDA tried to protect people against poisoning with this toxin, which is not destroyed by heating, by mandating that canned ackee fruits coming into the country test below a certain level. But there are no such regulations when it comes to importing lychees. Fortunately, they figured the high cost of these imported fruits and the likelihood that they would be eaten in small quantities by well-nourished consumers suggests there's little reason for concern in the USA. Small quantities? You don't know how I eat lychees. I used to sneak into movie theaters with big bags of them, pounds of them, because they were just so fun to peel and eat. How many is too many? In a series of a few hundred poisoning cases, people reported eating 300 grams to a kilo. Each lychee is about 10 grams, so that's 30 to 100 fruit. Most of the cases were in children, so we can probably safely say 30 to 100 lychees is too many at a time for kids. What about adults? In a self-experiment, a researcher just downed some lychees and measured the hypoglycin levels in his blood and urine. Based on how much was in the fruit, how much he ended up peeing out, and the urine levels found in victims, one can roughly calculate that adults shouldn't eat more than 200 fresh lychees at a time, or about 10 cans worth. Recently, the World Health Organization classified processed meat, also known as cured meat, bacon, ham, hot dogs, lunch meat, sausage, as definitively cancer-causing in humans. As if that's not enough, high-processed meat consumption has also been associated with increased risk of dying prematurely from all causes put together, and is a risk factor for several major chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, and stroke. But what about lung issues like asthma? Nitrites are added to processed meats as preservatives to preserve their pink so they don't turn gray, keeping them less rancid tasting, and to prevent the growth of diseases like botulism. But put that same sodium nitrite in the drinking water of lab animals, and they develop emphysema. They nearly all developed emphysema. But that's all the scientific knowledge we had on the subject coming into 2007 until this study, which found that frequent cured meat consumption is associated with increased risk for developing diseases like emphysema in people, too. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Eating it like every other day appeared to triple the odds of severe COPD. But it was just a snapshot in time study, so we don't know which came first, the sausage or the COPD. For that, we need prospective studies that follow people over time, and the big twin Harvard studies in both women and men both found that the risk of newly diagnosed COPD increased with a greater consumption of cured meats. Currently, we now have studies involving hundreds of thousands of people showing that higher intakes of processed meat were associated with a 40% increased risk of COPD. It comes out to like an 8% higher risk of COPD for each hot dog you eat a week, or each weekly breakfast-link sausage. What's going on? Yes, there are advanced glycation end products, so-called glycotoxins, that may be pro-inflammatory. There's the saturated fat that can also trigger inflammation in the airways. The high salt content can present a potential risk for lung inflammation, or the increase in systemic inflammation in general. But the reason attention is focused on the nitrites is because nitrites may actually be one of the mechanisms by which tobacco smoke causes diseases like emphysema. Yes, cured meats are the principal source of dietary nitrites, but nitrites are also byproducts of tobacco smoke. One of the main constituents, besides the carbon monoxide and nicotine, are nitrogen oxides that are converted in the lung to nitrites. The way nitrites appear to cause lung damage is by affecting connective tissue proteins like collagen and elastin. That's what helps keep the air spaces in your lungs open. But nitrite can modify these proteins in a way that mimic age-related damage, including the fragmentation of elastin. With that much lung injury, it's logical to assume processed meat consumption could also exacerbate the disease of those who already have it, and indeed, cured meat consumption increases risk of COPD patients ending up back in the hospital, about twice the risk for those eating more than average, and it appears the more you eat, the worse it is. Regarding lung health, processed meat intake has been associated with a likely increased risk of lung cancer, a decline in lung function, and chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. But what about asthma? High processed meat consumption has been associated with higher asthma symptoms as well. We knew about the higher maternal intake of meat before pregnancy, potentially increasing the risk of wheezing in our children later on, based on a study of more than 1,000 mother-child pairs. And we're not talking about aspirating meat into your lungs and being misdiagnosed with asthma. Those who ate the most cured meats were 76% more likely to experience worsening asthma than those who ate the least. Since obesity is a likely risk factor for asthma, though maybe the influence of the meat is just indirect by contributing to weight gain, that might be a small part of it, but the main effect appears to be direct, suggesting a deleterious role of cured meat independent of weight. Put all those studies together, and processed meat intake appears to be an important target for the prevention of adult asthma in the first place. Even if you don't have any lung issues, processed meat consumption was negatively associated with measures of normal lung function, while fruit and vegetable consumption and dietary total antioxidant capacity was associated with better lung function. But wait, you say, I just eat all natural, uncured hot dogs with no nitrates or nitrites added, in all caps. But if you magnifying glass the small print, it says, except those naturally occurring in cultured celery juice. See, to avoid saying they added nitrites, what they do is add something that has lots of nitrates, like celery, and a bacteria that converts the nitrates to nitrites. So they are adding nitrites. They're just straight-up duping consumers. We didn't add any nitrites, except, of course, for all the nitrites we added. We care about your health, so no nitrites added. And who wants pepperoni with nitrites? So we just added lots of nitrites. We would never add any nitrites. Now, just let the piggy picture distract you from the fact that we just lied to your face. Hormel was my favorite, except for those naturally occurring in seasoning. Pretty slick. Europe doesn't allow this kind of consumer fraud, demanding manufacturers explicitly label it as containing nitrites. You can't even call it natural. When Consumer Reports put it to the test, they found the nitrite levels in all the products was essentially the same. So no nitrites doesn't mean no nitrites. Consumer Reports and the Center for Science and the Public Interest have petitioned to stop this misleading practice. Nitrites are nitrites. Their chemical composition is absolutely the same, and so are the health effects. Millets are highly nutritious, but vastly ignored as a main source of food, primarily due to lack of awareness. You've heard of ancient grains. Millets ain't messing around, arguably the first grains cultivated by humankind, not just dating back 5,000 years, but maybe 10,000 years. Why the plural? Millets? Talk about lack of awareness. I had no idea that millet wasn't the name of a specific grain. Millet is just a generic term that doesn't just apply to a bunch of different species, but to a bunch of totally different plants. There are so-called major and minor millets. There's pearl millet, which is what I think most people think of as millet, but then there's proso, foxtail, and finger millets, which are all completely different grains. They look similar, but they're not the same. Fiber is one of the main things we're looking for in a whole grain, and kodo millet is like off the charts, but Compared to other grains, finger and foxtail millet also beat out the bunch, though note that what most people think of as millet is really on the low side. But looking at the polyphenol content, even plain millet beats out the other grains, including sorghum, which I previously hyped for its polyphenol content. But again, kodo millet seems to win the day. Total antioxidant-wise, though, kodo and finger millet are comparably high. Nutrition-wise, finger millet is said to have 8 times more calcium than other grains, but it looks to me like more like 10 times more, just off the charts, 3 times as much calcium as milk. Some of the millets are exceptionally high in iron as well. Regular millet is high, but barnyard millet has like 5 times more iron than steak. Okay, so nutritious, but what about specific potential health benefits? In the medical literature, you'll read things like this. Millets may prevent cardiovascular disease by reducing triglycerides in hyperlipidemic rats. Who cares, other than perhaps pet owners, whether a food reduces cardiovascular disease in rodents? There was that epidemiological study in China that found lower esophageal cancer mortality rates in areas that ate more millet and sorghum compared to corn and wheat, but that may have been more due to avoiding a contaminating carcinogenic fungus than from benefit in the millet itself. Studies show millets may be effective against cancer cell proliferation in a petri dish, with kodo and proso millet rapidly inhibiting cancer cell growth compared to pearl or foxtail millet, knocking down the growth of cancer cells but leaving normal cells alone, reducing the growth of colon cancer cells, as well as human breast cancer and human liver cancer cells, potentially also helping to prevent metastases by inhibiting cancer cell migration. My patients are neither pets nor petri dishes, though, and to date there have been no clinical cancer trials with millet. Are there any unique health-promoting attributes? Finger millet is supposedly known for its health benefits, such as blood sugar lowering, cholesterol lowering, and anti-ulcer characteristics, but the anti-ulcer study they cite just noted that some of the areas with a low incidence of ulcers also happen to be eating millet, but that's far from establishing cause and effect. And the cholesterol-lowering study they cite, it explores what happens when you take tail tendons from rats and soak them in sugar and millet. What? Right? But the blood sugar-lowering benefits are legit. Apart from the fact that millets don't contain gluten, which is good for the 1 or 2% of people with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, millets can also be exploited in the management of type 2 diabetes due to their blood sugar-lowering properties, as reported by several studies on millets and millet-based foods in actual people, which we'll cover next. How does millet come to the help of diabetics? Millet come to the portion of the starch in millet is resistant starch, meaning resistant to digestion in our small intestine, so providing a bounty for the good bugs in our colon. Here's how the various millets do, all way more than more common grains like rice or wheat, but proso and kodo millet lead the pack. What's going on? The protein matrix in millet not only acts as a physical barrier, but actually also partially sequesters your starch-munching enzyme, and the millet polyphenols can also act as starch blockers in and of themselves. Millet also has remarkably slower stomach-emptying times than other starchy foods. If you eat white rice, boiled potatoes, or pasta, your stomach takes about an hour to digest it before starting to slowly dump it into your intestines, and 2 or 3 hours to empty about halfway. Whereas you eat sorghum or millet, and stomach emptying doesn't even start until 2 or 3 hours, and may take 5 hours to empty even halfway. Note this was for both a thick millet porridge or for just like millet couscous. So since the non-viscous millet couscous meal was also equally slow in emptying, this suggests there may just be something about millet itself that helps slow stomach emptying, which should blunt the blood sugar spike, but you don't know until you put it to the test. And indeed, Millet caused about a 20% lower surge in blood sugar than the same amount of carbs in the form of rice. Remember how excited I was to show you how it only took the body half the insulin to handle sorghum compared to a grain like corn? Well, millet did even better. Give a group of pre-diabetics only about 3/4 of a cup of millet a day, and within 6 weeks their insulin resistance dropped so much their pre-diabetic fasting blood sugars turned into non-pre-diabetic blood sugars. This so-called self-controlled clinical trial, the same subjects before and after, that's just a sneaky way of saying an uncontrolled trial. There was no control group that didn't add the millet or added something else. And we know just being in a study under scrutiny can cause people to eat better in other ways. So we don't know what role, if any, the millet itself played. What we need is a randomized, controlled crossover trial where the same people eat both a millet-containing and non-millet-containing diet and see which works better. And here we go, a randomized crossover study having hundreds of patients, both doing American Diabetes Association type diet with or without about 1 1/3 cup of millet every day, and the millet-based diet lowered hemoglobin A1C levels, meaning an improvement in long-term blood sugar control, along with some side benefits like lowering cholesterol. The target for good blood sugar control recommended by the American Diabetes Association is an A1C less than 7. Now, they started out at an 8.37, but after a few months on millet, dropped to an average of 6.77. Is it just because they lost weight or something? No, suggesting that it was an effect specific to the millet. But they didn't just give millet. They mixed the millet with split black lentils and spices, and we know from dozens of randomized controlled experimental trials in people with and without diabetes that the consumption of pulses, meaning beans, split peas, chickpeas, or lentils, can improve long-term measures of blood sugar control like A1C levels. So while the researchers conclude that millets have the potential for a protective role in the management of diabetes, a more accurate conclusion might be a mix of millet and lentils can be protective, though, hey, maybe the spices help too. They didn't say which ones they used, and I couldn't get hold of the authors, but a similar study done by one of the same researchers included about a tablespoon a day of a mixture of fenugreek, coriander, cumin, and black pepper with a fifth spice, perhaps cinnamon or turmeric. The large national cardiology conferences may attract the majority of cardiologists in the entire country in one place. So hey, if you're going to have a heart attack, that would seem to be the place to do it. And indeed, that's when the American Heart Association president had his within hours of his presidential address. With so many of the nation's top cardiologists at the conference, maybe that's a bad time to go into cardiac arrest anywhere else, though. You don't know until you put it to the test. To their surprise, they found substantially lower mortality among those going into cardiac failure or cardiac arrest during the big national cardiology meetings. Why is the death rate lower when most of the cardiologists are away? One potential explanation is that the intensity of care may be lower, suggesting the harms of such care may unexpectedly outweigh the benefits. Their results echo paradoxical findings documented during a labor strike by Israeli physicians, during which mortality rates evidently dramatically fell. And it wasn't just one strike. It has been looked at multiple times, and in all reported cases, mortality either stayed the same or decreased. In 4 of the 7 cases, mortality dropped as a result of the strike, and in 3, there was no significant change. The fact is that many current medical practices have been found to offer no benefit and, in fact, potential harms. Even physicians themselves estimate that about 1/5 of medical care is unnecessary. A national summit was convened by the Joint Commission that accredits hospitals and the American Medical Association to identify areas of overuse, treatments that provide zero or negligible benefit, potentially exposing patients to a risk of harm for nothing. They called out 5 practices. For example, prescribing antibiotics for viral upper respiratory tract infections, spending $1 billion prescribing drugs that don't work, and if anything, just make things worse. But another overuse practice they identified was elective percutaneous coronary intervention. In other words, angioplasty and stents. Just to get everyone on the same page before we dive in, coronary artery disease, the #1 killer of men and women, involves blockages in the blood vessels that supply the heart muscle itself. Low blood flow can lead to a type of chest pain called angina, or, if severe enough, to a heart attack. Plant-based diets and lifestyle programs have been shown to reverse these blockages by treating the cause of why our arteries are clogging up in the first place. But for those unable or unwilling to change their diets, there are drugs that can help, as well as more invasive treatments such as open-heart surgery to try to bypass the blockage, or percutaneous coronary intervention. That's when doctors insert small balloons or metal tunnels called stents up through large blood vessels, typically in the groin, and thread them all the way up into the heart. That way, you can get inside the blocked vessels and try to open them up and prop them open. Now, during a heart attack, this can be life-saving, but hundreds of thousands of these procedures are done every year for stable angina, meaning on a non-emergency basis, which can relieve symptoms but doesn't actually reduce your risk of having or dying from a heart attack in the future. However, not everyone knows that. They mistakenly think the procedure offers more than just symptom relief. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this video series. As Harvard put it, stents are for pain, not protection. But then, unbelievably, it was discovered that stents may not even help with pain, as revealed in this double-blind, randomized controlled trial. Wait, you can blind people to the active treatment in drug trials by giving them a placebo sugar pill, but wouldn't you kinda notice if you got surgery or not? Like whether or not they cut into your groin? Not if you got sham surgery, placebo surgery, where they cut into everyone, thread up the catheter, and at the last moment randomly actually do or do not actually place the actual stent. And those who got the fake surgery did just as well as those who got the regular surgery. Wait, there are no benefits to angioplasty and stents outside of an emergency setting? Doesn't prevent heart attacks, doesn't enable you to live longer, and doesn't even help with symptoms? And since the procedure carries some risks, including death, maybe stents should be used only by people who are actively having heart attacks. But wait, so hundreds of thousands of people are getting these operations for nothing? How do the doctors justify it? Is it just greed? How do they get patients to sign up? Do they just not tell them the truth? And wait, why doesn't it work? You are, after all, opening up a blocked artery. There's just so many questions, which we'll start addressing next. Angioplasty, which is when a tiny balloon is inserted into a narrowed coronary artery feeding your heart to force it to open wider to improve blood flow, wasn't put to the test in a randomized controlled trial until 1992, and it failed to prevent heart attacks and failed to show any survival benefit, but they only followed them out 6 months, and including people with relatively minor disease who maybe just weren't sick enough to benefit. Enter the MASS trial, enrolling those with severe blockages high up in their widowmaker artery, or widower-maker. Coronary artery disease is also the #1 killer of women, and followed them out for years, and there was no difference in subsequent mortality or heart attacks. Okay, but there were only about 200 patients. Maybe the benefit was so subtle that you just needed a greater number of patients to tease out the effect. Enter the RITA-2 study, randomizing more than 1,000 patients, and they did indeed get a clear difference in the risk of future death and heart attack, but it was in the wrong direction. The angioplasty group suffered twice the risk compared to those randomized to forego surgery. Okay, but that was all before stents came into vogue. Instead of just ballooning up the artery, how about permanently inserting a stent, a metal mesh tube, to prop the artery open? Surely that's gotta help. Which brings us to MASS 2, and still no benefit. Okay, but that was after just 1 year. But still no benefit after 5 years, or even 10 years later. The COURAGE trial was the biggie, randomizing thousands of patients, and it fell flat on its face. Yes, but those were mostly bare metal stents, not the fancy new drug-eluting stents that slowly release drugs. And what about high-risk groups, those with diabetes, those with more serious disease, those with 100% blocked arteries days after a heart attack? And meta-analysis after meta-analysis, 5 trials with 5,000 patients, and no reduction in death, heart attack, or even angina pain. 10 trials with more than 6,000 patients, and no benefit for survival, heart attacks, or pain relief. Now, we're up to more than a dozen major trials, and no benefit from angioplasty and stents. Furthermore, multiple analyses have failed to identify a single high-risk subset with stable disease that benefits. How is that possible? I mean, you're physically opening up blood flow. The reason it doesn't work is because the majority of heart attacks in real life are caused by narrowings under 70%. So the plaques in your arteries that kill you tend not to be the ones that are restricting blood flow. Here's 2 atherosclerotic plaques. This one is squeezing off the blood flow so much you can see it on angiogram and go after it with a stent. Problem solved, life saved, right? No, because it was the invisible one that wasn't even impeding blood flow that was gonna kill you all along. Most heart attacks are caused by non-obstructive plaques that don't even cut blood flow 50%. There's this clogged pipe misconception that has been difficult to dislodge, imagining that cholesterol plaques slowly, inexorably encroach on blood flow, eventually cutting it off completely, triggering a heart attack. In reality, coronary artery disease is an inflammatory disease in which the cholesterol from the blood being deposited in the artery walls causes an inflammatory reaction like a pimple, and when those pimples pop, they cause the blood in the arteries to clot at the site. Before rupture, these plaques often do not limit flow and may be invisible to angiography and stress tests, therefore not amenable to angioplasty and stents. Old plaques are like old scarred pimples. Right? The tightest blockages are made up of mostly just calcified, dense, fibrous scar tissue. They can still rupture and kill you, but there are so many more of the smaller lesions brewing which are hidden from view. The way we visualize coronary arteries is with an angiogram where X-rays are taken, which inject this black-looking dye into the arteries, so we can only see plaques that encroach on the blood flow. That's why you get these kinds of tip-of-the-iceberg illustrations, right? The point of which is to emphasize that most of the atherosclerotic plaque in the coronary arteries is not seen well by angiography. I mean, to really understand what's going on in people's arteries, we must turn to autopsy. William Clifford Roberts is probably the most preeminent cardiovascular pathologist in the world. What did he learn after studying coronary arteries for 50 years? After digging around in nearly 2,000 bodies, he learned that atherosclerosis is a systemic disease. In patients with fatal coronary artery disease, the quantity of plaque is enormous. There's not just one plaque here, another plaque there, with normal clean arteries in between. The plaques are continuous. Not a single 5mm segment in the entire coronary artery tree is devoid of plaque. So isolated coronary disease is a myth. There's no such thing as one-vessel disease, two-vessel disease, left main disease. Plaque is in all of them if it's in one of them. Adding up the lengths of the 4 major coronary arteries that feed the heart, the right coronary artery, the left main, the circumflex, and the left anterior descending, they add up to about 11 inches of coronary arteries, which for examination can be cut into about 50 quarter-inch slices. And this is what you see, not plaque gunking up 1 or 2 slivers, but all throughout the coronary arteries. If you look at over 1,000 of these slices from dozens of patients who died of heart attacks, not a single segment was devoid of plaque. So no wonder why just stenting open one area has no impact on heart attacks or death. Millions of people have gotten stents for stable coronary artery disease, yet we now know that for such patients, angioplasty and stent placement doesn't actually prevent heart attacks, doesn't even offer long-term angina pain relief, and doesn't improve survival. Why? Because the most dangerous plaques, the ones most vulnerable to rupture leading to a heart attack, are not the ones doctors put stents in, not the ones often even seen on angiogram to be obstructing blood flow. So we need to avoid the therapeutic illusion that we are accomplishing more than is shown by the evidence. I mean, it looks great, you're opening up blood flow, but if it doesn't actually help, why do it? And we're not just talking about billions of dollars wasted. Stent placement and the blood thinner drugs you have to go on can cause complications, including heart failure, stroke, and death. The risks are relatively low, less than a 1% chance it'll kill you or stroke you out. The 15% risk of heart attack is only if your stent clogs off at a later date, which only happens about 1% in the near term. The 13% kidney injury is legit, though, due to the dyes they have to inject, but that typically just heals on its own. The most serious complications, like death, only happen in about 1 in 150 cases. But you have to multiply that by the fact that hundreds of thousands of procedures are being done every year. In an emergency setting, like while you're actively having a heart attack, angioplasty can be life-saving. But these hundreds of thousands are for stable coronary artery disease, for which there appears to be no benefits. So then doctors are killing or stroking out thousands of people a year for nothing. And that's not even counting the tens of thousands of silent mini-strokes that may contribute to cognitive decline caused by these procedures. Between 11 and 17% of people who go through angioplasty or stenting come away with new brain lesions. It's like up to 1 in 6. How do doctors convince patients to sign up for these when they don't lower the risk of death or heart attack or offer long-term symptom relief? Well, apparently by conveniently failing to inform patients that they don't lower the risk of death or heart attack or offer long-term symptom relief. Cardiologists are aware of how little they help, but studies have consistently demonstrated that patients think stents will reduce their risk of heart attack or death. More than 70% of patients erroneously believed that stents would extend their life expectancy or prevent future heart attacks. That's why this study was done, to figure out where patients are getting these crazy ideas from. And the answer is that many patients are being kept in the dark, pressured into procedures that won't benefit them the way they think, by doctors that overstate the benefits and understate the risks. Why would they do that? Well, one reason could be because doctors may be paid per procedure. Doctors are paid more for offering stents than common sense diet and lifestyle changes. Patients with stable coronary disease undergoing angioplasty and stent placement are frequently misinformed. Of 59 recorded conversations, only 2 included all 7 elements of informed decision-making. In other words, telling people they have a choice, explaining the problem, discussing alternatives, pros and cons, informing patients the procedure may not work, asking if they understand, even just asking if patients have any questions, and asking patients what they want to do. Only 3% of doctor-patient discussions about stents hit even just these basic elements. And that's when the doctors knew they were being recorded. So, if anything, this may be like the best-case scenario, 3%. Quoting from the Journal of the Cleveland Clinic, when it comes to angioplasty and stents, true informed consent rarely occurs. No wonder that among the nearly 1,000 patients surveyed across 10 U.S. academic community hospitals, just 1% knew the truth. Remarkably, some blame the patients for their ignorance. They're the ones that overestimate and misunderstand the benefits, like those patients with cancer who think their chemo offers the potential for a cure. They have a therapeutic misconception. Don't look at the patients to find out why so many patients are accepting procedures with questionable benefits. Patients think they're having life-saving procedures because medical professionals want them to believe that this is so. Now, it's not like those 95% of cardiologists are lying to their patients and saying that it'll reduce their risk. They just happen to conveniently have omitted that little detail. But in the absence of information to the contrary, most patients are going to naturally assume that's the case. Why Why would they assume that? Because patients have this crazy concept of personal care, that a physician's first obligation is solely to the patient's well-being. How naive can you get? In the absence of information, or even when presented with evidence to the contrary, patients tend to believe that treatments offered will be beneficial. It's true. Even if you explicitly tell patients that stents don't reduce the risk of heart attacks, yes, you can cut that misperception in half. That's great. That with 2 sentences, you can dispel the myths in most people. But many participants continue to believe that angioplasty and stents prevent heart attacks, even when explicitly told they do not, along with a detailed explanation why. After all, why would doctors be pushing them if they didn't help? That's a good question, which we'll address next. Angioplasty and stent placement continue to be frequently performed for patients with non-emergency coronary artery disease, despite clear evidence that it provides minimal benefit. For example, it does not prevent heart attacks or death, yet as many as 9 out of 10 patients mistakenly believe that procedure would reduce their chances of having a heart attack. But at the same time, the cardiologists weren't stupid. Those who referred them for the stent and those who performed the procedure didn't believe that. Okay, then why were they doing it? Focus groups of cardiologists have documented a chasm between knowledge and behavior. While aware of the evidence to the contrary, they recommend and perform PCI, angioplasty and stents, because they somehow believe it helps in some ill-defined way. Physicians tended to justify a non-evidence-based approach. I know the data shows there's no benefit, but by focusing on how easy it is to do the procedure and the belief that an open artery was better even if it didn't actually affect outcomes, all the while minimizing the risks. The procedure only kills 1 in 150, so here some are blaming the patients for not listening, but maybe it's the physicians who are the ones ignoring the evidence. Or maybe physicians have too poor a grasp of the relevant statistics to adequately inform the patient. Regardless, what we've got here is a failure to communicate. So, tools have been developed. For example, a sample-informed consent document that lays out the potential benefits and risks, even laying out how many procedures your doctors have done and your out-of-pocket costs. Note there's a lot of blanks to be filled in, though. What are some concrete numbers? The Mayo Clinic came up with some prototype decision-making tools. In terms of benefits, will having a stent placed in my heart prevent heart attacks or death? No, stents will not lower the risk of heart attack or death. But a week later, those getting stents report they feel better at least, though a year later, even the symptomatic relief benefit appears to disappear. Okay, so there appeared to be this temporary relief in chest pain benefit. What about the risks? During the stent procedure, out of 100 people, 2 will have bleeding or damage to a blood vessel, and 1 will have a tad more serious complications such as heart attack, stroke, or death. And then, after that, during the first year after the stent, 3 will have a bleeding event because of the blood thinners you have to take because you have this foreign material in your heart. But that doesn't always work, and so 2 will have their stent clogged off, leading to a heart attack. What does the world's #1 stent manufacturer have to say for itself? They acknowledge the evidence shows stents don't make people live longer, but hey, living longer is overrated. Look, if that's all we cared about, living longer, entire disciplines of medicine would disappear. Why go to the dentist? Of course, the difference is that 80% don't believe that getting a cavity filled is going to save their life, like they mistakenly do for stents, and there's no 1 in 100 chance that you won't make it out of the dentist chair. The stent companies actively misinform with ads like this. Open your heart and your life. Life wide open. Freedom begins here. Their TV ad mentioned a few side effects. Turns out they missed a few, but more importantly, they're giving the false impression that stents are more than just expensive, risky Band-Aids for temporary symptom relief. Hey, but what's wrong with symptom relief? Look at those smiling faces, right? Even if the benefits are only symptomatic and don't last long, look, if people think that outweighs the risk, what's the problem? What if I told you that even the symptom relief may just be an elaborate placebo effect, and you could get the same relief with a fake surgery, so there really weren't any benefits at all? We'll see what the science says next. Angioplasty and stents for non-emergency coronary artery disease is one of the most common invasive procedures performed in the United States. Though it appeared to offer immediate relief of angina chest pain in stable patients with coronary artery disease, it didn't actually translate into a lower risk of heart attack or death. This is because the atherosclerotic plaques that narrow blood flow tend not to be the ones that burst and kill you. But hey, symptom control is important. That's much of what we do in medicine. But cardiology has a bad track record when it comes to performing procedures that don't actually end up helping at all. Case in point, internal mammary artery ligation. Though it didn't make much anatomical sense why tying off arteries to the chest wall and breast would somehow improve coronary artery circulation, it worked like a charm. Immediate improvement in 95% of hundreds of patients. It could have been just some elaborate placebo effect, and they were just cutting into people for nothing? There's only one way to find out. You cut into people for nothing. They randomized people to get the actual surgery or a fake surgery, where they cut you open and get to the last step but don't actually tie off those arteries. And the patients who underwent the fake surgery experienced the same relief. Check out the testimonials. Immediately, I felt better. 95% better. No chest trouble, even with exercise. I'm cured. And these are all people who got the sham surgery. So it was just an extravagant placebo effect. Think about it. Some frightened, poorly informed man with angina chest pain winding himself tighter and tighter, sensitizing himself to every twinge of chest discomfort, who then comes into the environment of a great medical center and a powerful, positive, paternalistic personality, and here's how great it's gonna be, goes through the whole operation and leaves a new man with his trademark scar. One sham patient was actually cured, though. The patient is optimistic and says he feels much better. Office note the next day, patient dropped dead. So, hey, no more chest pain. This has happened over and over. I've got an idea. How about we burn holes into the heart muscle with lasers to create channels for blood flow? Worked great until it was proven that it doesn't work at all. Cutting the nerves to your kidneys was heralded as a cure for hard-to-treat high blood pressure until sham surgery proved the procedure itself was a sham. The necessity for placebo-controlled trials has been rediscovered several times in cardiology, typically to considerable surprise. Before they're debunked, often the therapy is thought to be so beneficial that a placebo-controlled trial is deemed unnecessary and perhaps even unethical. That was the case with stents. Hundreds of thousands of angioplasties and stents are done every year, yet placebo-controlled trials had never been done. Why? Because cardiologists were so unquestionably sure that it worked that it would be unethical to perform a fake procedure to prove something we already know is true. When patients are aware that they've had a stent, they have clear reduction in angina and improved quality of life. But what if they weren't aware? Would it still work? Enter the Orbita trial. After all, anti-angina medication is only taken seriously if there's blinded evidence of a symptom relief against a placebo pill. So hey, why not pit stents against a placebo procedure? In both groups, doctors threaded a catheter through the groin or wrist of the patient and with X-ray guidance go up to the blocked artery and then either inserted a stent or just pulled the catheter back out. They had problems even getting the study funded. They were told, we already know the answer to this question. Of course stents work. And that's even what the researchers themselves thought. They were interventional cardiologists themselves. They just wanted to prove it. Boy, were they surprised. Even in patients with severe coronary artery narrowing, angioplasty and stents did not increase exercise time more than the fake procedure. Unbelievable, read the New York Times headline, remarking that the results stunned leading cardiologists by countering decades of clinical experience. In response to the blowback, the researchers wrote that they sympathize with everyone's shock and disbelief. Yes, we could have tried to spin it somehow, but they had a duty to preserve scientific integrity. While some commended them for challenging the existing dogma around a procedure that has become so routine, ingrained, and profitable, others questioned their ethics. After all, 4 patients in the placebo group had complications from the guide wire insertion and required emergency measures to seal the tear they made in the artery. There were also 3 major bleeding events in the placebo group, so they suffered risks without even a chance of benefit. But far from demonstrating the risks of sham-controlled trials, this demonstrates exactly what patients are being subjected to on a routine basis for nothing. Those few complications in the trial are dwarfed by the thousands that have been killed or maimed by the procedure over the years. You want unethical? How about the fact that an invasive procedure has been performed on millions of people before it was actually ever put to the test? Maybe we should consider the absence, not the presence, of sham-controlled trials to be the greater injustice. When a former FDA commissioner was asked at the American Heart Association meeting whether sham control should be required for the approval of all devices, he replied, "Do you want to get the truth or not?" In 2007, we learned from the COURAGE trial that angioplasty and stents don't reduce the risk of death or heart attack, but patients didn't seem to get the memo. Only 1% realized that there was no mortality or heart attack benefit, perhaps because cardiologists failed to happen to mention this little fact. One can imagine that if patients actually understood all they were getting was symptomatic relief, then they'd be less likely to go under the knife. But then 10 years later, the ORBITA trial was published showing even the promise of symptom relief was an illusion. The implications are profound and far-reaching. First and foremost, the results showed unequivocally that there are no benefits to angioplasty and stents for stable heart disease. So basically, patients would be risking harm for no benefit whatsoever. So it's hard to imagine a scenario where a fully informed patient would choose an invasive procedure for nothing, remember the stent consent form? Now it looks like this. So, is the ORBITA trial the last nail in the coffin for stents in non-emergency situations? An editorial in the Journal of Cardiovascular Revascularization Medicine disagreed, pointing to the broad angina relief that occurred in both arms. In other words, stents helped, even if the fake operation without stents helped just as much. So hey, if I give a patient a stent and they are benefiting from the placebo effect, well, who am I to interfere with that benefit of this quote-unquote therapy? Well, then why not do fake surgeries? Stent placement can go for like $40,000. It'd be cheaper to just fake the whole thing, right? The reason we shouldn't keep electively stenting people is because there's a body count. During stent placement, 2% of patients develop bleeding or blood vessel damage, and another 1% die or have a heart attack or a stroke. And then because you're having something stuck in your chest, 3% of patients have a bleeding event from the blood thinners you have to be on, or the blood thinners don't work and the stent clots off and causes a heart attack. Right? Why are they still done when we don't just have no evidence of benefit, but in many cases, explicit evidence of no benefit? One of the sources of resistance may be all the financial gain. These procedures make a lot of money for hospitals. Don't expect them to be promoting lifestyle changes anytime soon, nor will physicians quickly abandon a practice that seems to make sense and supports their income. Is it that simple? Is it that famous Upton Sinclair quote on how difficult it is to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it? Think that's just cynicism? Let's ask doctors themselves. Thousands of physicians were surveyed, and 70% believe that physicians provide unnecessary procedures when they profit from them. That's what doctors themselves believe, and the data bears this out. Doctors have been shown to make different clinical decisions for patients based on how much they get paid. For example, when choosing which chemotherapy to treat breast cancer, increasing a physician's margin by 10% can yield up to a 177% increase in the likelihood of choosing one drug over another. That may be why cesarean sections are more likely to be performed in for-profit hospitals compared to non-profit hospitals, operating on commission. Pay surgeons per procedure, and you can increase surgery rates 78%. Could that explain why we do 101% more angioplasties than any other rich countries? A study on physician financial incentives and treatment choices in heart attack management found that they do indeed respond to payments, and the response is quite large. Unconditionally, plans that pay physicians more for more invasive treatments seem to result in more invasive treatments. So it may actually be quite common for patients to receive different treatments based on whether the doctor is getting paid per procedure. One of my heroes, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, who always tries to see the best in people, even he had to break down and admit that compensation may be playing a role after evidence surfaced that docs are running up millions doing unnecessary stent implants. Docs like Mark Midii, who inserted 30 in a single day. That could be like $1 million worth of billing. As a token of their gratitude, a sales rep from the stent company spent $2,000 to buy him a whole slow-smoked pig, peach cobbler, and all the fixings. We're the only developed country where healthcare is delivered like this, explained the chief of cardiovascular medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. The economic incentives are just too strong. The history of medicine abounds with false dogmas that were simply assumed and later, sometimes much too long later, overcome. Like the Women's Health Initiative study that showed that giving women Premarin, hormone replacement therapy, increased the risk of the #1 killer of women heart disease, as well as breast cancer risk to boot. Millions of women stopped taking it, and the breast cancer rates came down. Another such reversal of established medical practice is angioplasty and stents for stable coronary artery disease, for which billions are spent on procedures shown unequivocally to offer no benefits. So why are cardiologists still doing them? Researchers did some focus groups and concluded that although cardiologists may believe that they're benefiting their patients, this belief appears to be based on emotional and psychological factors rather than on evidence. The sense of irrationality surrounding this practice is so strong that the phenomenon has been coined the oculostenotic reflex, like you see a narrowing and they stent it like they can't even help it. Since the procedure carries some risk, including death, there's an argument that stents should only be used for people who are actively having heart attacks in an emergency or unstable situation. Thankfully, there are now published appropriate use criteria in place to help guide cardiologists, and the good news is that now 82% of stents are reported to be performed in these emergency or unstable situations, so we can disregard that study that showed there's no benefit in stable patients, since now it's almost always done just in unstable patients like it should be. Or at least it's almost always reported that way. There are two ways that physicians could comply with the rules. One is to do fewer unnecessary procedures, which is the whole point, but hey, where's the money in that? The other way to comply is to make unnecessary procedures seem necessary. Wait, are they implying that a doctor would try to game the system by telling a patient that they had much more serious unstable disease than they actually had, so they could carry out the procedure anyway? This is referred to upcoding. Another word for it would be fraud. Researchers found that some of that decline in inappropriate use may indeed be doctors falsely and intentionally misclassifying patients with stable angina as unstable angina, because as soon as those appropriate use criteria went into effect, all of a sudden, there was suspiciously a 4 to 10-fold increase in the rates of stents for acute coronary syndromes like heart attacks. In New York, the proportion of stents labeled as acute but performed as outpatient procedures increased 14-fold. There's no biologically plausible reason why that would happen, so they were unnecessary procedures, unnecessary cost, and unnecessary patient harm. Harm not only from the risk of getting an unnecessary stent, but also by lying to the patient by exaggerating how bad their heart disease is. At best, this practice damages the credibility of the profession, violates patient autonomy, and puts the patient at risk for complications, and at worst, may cross the threshold into criminal activity. What's the solution? There could be like an independent review panel to protect patients, or we could simply remove the financial incentive to perform more procedures. How many other established standards of medical care are wrong? Who knows? Bloodletting was standard of care for thousands of years. Rigorous questioning of long-established practices is difficult. There are thousands of clinical trials, but most deal with trivialities or efforts to buttress the sales of specific products. Given this conundrum, it's possible that some entire medical subspecialties are based on little evidence. Ironically, in the case of heart stents, in the landmark COURAGE trial that showed stents were useless for extending life, what did seem to determine longevity was how many risk factors they were able to control. Those that nailed all 6 by lowering their blood pressure, cholesterol, weight, smoking, and improving their diets and activity had 5 times the survival over the subsequent 14 years than those who didn't. Should we be surprised that angioplasty and stents failed to improve prognosis? After all, it does nothing to modify the underlying disease process itself. In other words, it doesn't treat the cause. Even if stents helped with symptoms beyond the placebo effect, it would still just be treating the symptoms and not the disease. And so no wonder the disease continues to progress until the patient is disabled into death. Thus, Dr. Esselstyn wrote, the leading killer of men and women in Western civilization is being left untreated. What is instead being practiced is palliative cardiology, non-treatment of heart disease leading to disease extension and frequently and eventually fatal outcome. Deaths by the plane load every week just regarded as unfortunate rather than a national preventable tragedy. It's as though in ignoring this dairy, oil, and animal product-based illness, we are wedded to provide futile attempts at temporary symptomatic relief rather than the cure. Thankfully, we are on the cusp of a seismic revolution in health, not another pill, a procedure, or operation, but instead treating the underlying cause of heart disease with whole food, plant-based nutrition, perhaps the mightiest tool medicine has ever had in its toolbox. To get there, we need to fight a key nutrition deficiency in education. 90% of cardiologists, 90% reported receiving no or minimal nutrition education during their cardiology training, leaving fewer than 1 in 10 confident in their nutrition knowledge. So maybe it's a good thing that most spend 3 minutes or less discussing nutrition with their patients. Only 1 in 5 themselves even ate 5 servings of fruits and veggies a day. Thankfully, this life-saving information is slowly but surely getting out there. Medical education is focused on being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff rather than a fence at the top. Money talks. There's very little money in promoting eating broccoli and going for a walk. I was so eager to see the citation they used for that and was so honored when I did. Hospital food needs a revolution. I was surprised to find out that most inpatient meals served in hospitals are not required to meet any sort of national nutrition standards for a healthy diet, and indeed, analysis on the nutritional value of food served to patients in teaching hospitals found that many did not meet dietary recommendations. Warning, read the headlines, hospital food, bad for health. A registered dietitian wrote in to defend the hospital, saying, hey, at least over half the hospitals met at least over half the guidelines, and hey, they're so stringent anyway, little eggs and dairy, you can blow through your limits. The provocative conclusions of their analysis only lead the media and the public to conclude that we're a bunch of dunces who have no understanding of the relation between nutrition and disease prevention. Well, if the white coat fits. Look, we spend a fortune on training doctors. You'd think we could follow through on some of the simplest things like food. A good diet is as necessary to the recovery of health as anything else, and it's folly to pretend that it's beyond the power of our profession to change this, a line written 75 years ago, and still there's pushback. Or perhaps we should question whether a healthy diet given to a helpless patient during a 2 to 10-day hospital stay benefits anyone or anything other than the dietitian's sense of doing good, responded one doctor. Always bothered when patients are deprived of a desired morning egg because a healthy diet has been ordered. I mean, what's a few days of a little heart-unfriendly diet in the scheme of things? But it's the message we're sending, where the presence of foods on the hospital tray sends a message to patients as to what's healthy and acceptable for them to eat, responded the researchers that did the hospital foods analysis. We still can think of no better place or opportunity to set an example of good nutrition than when patients are in hospitals. After all, public schools in California have banned the sale of soda for over a decade. Why not children's hospitals? In a study of California healthcare facilities serving children, 3/4 of foods and drinks wouldn't have been allowed in schools. We're talking soda and candy. Having unhealthy items in healthcare facilities and seeing staff consume these products contradicts the hypercritical nutrition and health messages children may get from healthcare providers. On adult menus, nearly all meals contained excess salt, with 100% of daily menus exceeding the American Heart Association's recommendation for staying under 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day. This means meals offered to patients may actually contribute to the exacerbation of the very conditions that may have led them to the hospitalization. But if hospitals stuck to the recommended limits of salt, the food wouldn't taste as good, responded an executive from the Salt Institute, to which the researchers replied, "Taste is good? We're talking about hospital food, right? It doesn't taste good no matter how much salt you put on it." In the very least, we should prepare all meals low sodium, and then look, if they want to add salt, it's their choice, right? They want to get someone to wheel them out into the parking lot and smoke, that's their business. But we shouldn't be blowing cigarette smoke into people's rooms 3 times a day, whether they want it or not. Interestingly, studies suggest that when individuals are allowed to salt food to taste, they rarely add as much as often it becomes prepackaged within the food. Check it out. Switch people to a low-sodium diet, and sure, they use their salt shakers more, but overall their salt intake dips way down. And the study subject said it tasted just as salty, right? Because salt added to the surface of foods makes it taste saltier. But when a hospital meal comes to you pre-salted to the hilt, inpatients may not even have the option to consume healthier levels. In defense of their unhealthy food, one hospital food service provider explained that they're just giving people what they want. Are we really going to deny people who are going through difficult times any small comfort they can get? That's one of the reasons why this clinical director sends candy bars and ice cream to cancer patients. You know what else might help take the edge off? A nice long drag on a cigarette. Here you go, Timmy, try this. Hospitals used to sell cigarettes primarily for patient convenience. "I don't think I could deny a paying patient the right to smoke a cigarette," said one administrator. "I'll have to insist we have cigarette machines in the hospital as a service to the patient." But some made the radical suggestion that tobacco products should not be sold in the hospital. This wasn't from the 1950s, but from the 1980s. Yet the irony of hospitals allowing the sale of a major cause of preventable illness and death in this country had rarely been discussed in the medical literature, and especially ironic that smoking was, of course, permitted in the doctors' lounges. To their credit, though, U.S. hospitals underwent the first industry-wide ban on smoking in the workplace by the mid-90s. Well, now hospitals again have the opportunity to take the lead and create food environments that are consistent with their mission to cure the sick and to promote health. Though the simple act of serving food that meets national nutritional standards, our hospitals will act in the best health interests of their patients and their staff, and will undoubtedly again be leaders in our ongoing dialogue on how to improve the food supply, which in turn will improve the health of us all. Strict anti-smoking regulations were often criticized as being too harsh, as if disease and premature death brought on by smoking were any easier. Right? Think my smoking diet parallel is hyperbole? Well, guess what? Today, the major cause of preventable illness and death in this country is no longer tobacco. The leading cause of death in America is now the American diet. Hospitals in the United States serve millions of patient meals each day and are optimally positioned to model a healthy diet. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is now the most frequent chronic liver disease, thanks in part to our epidemic of obesity, now even seen in children. As many as nearly 78% of obese children may have fatty liver disease. Why do we care? Because a fatty liver can progress into fatty hepatitis, which can cause scarring and liver cirrhosis, which is bad enough without also causing you to develop liver cancer, too. OK, so what's the source of the liver fat in fatty liver disease? There are three main sources: the excess sugar in our diet, excess fat in our diet, and the fat spilling over from your own excess body fat. How do we know excess dietary sugar is bad? Because it's been put to the test. Because if you randomize teens with fatty liver disease to a diet low in free sugars, meaning added sugar and sugary beverages, they experience a significant improvement within 8 weeks. Given this new data, Liver Journal editorial read, a strong argument can be made that we are beyond any period of uncertainty about the harmful effects of excess sugar consumption, and that we must now act to inform the public on the health risks of eating too much sugar. How do we know excess dietary fat is bad? Because it's been put to the test. Randomize people to the same low-calorie diet, but one that's low-fat versus one that's high-fat, and within just 2 weeks, the low-fat diet decreased liver fat by 20%, whereas the same number of calories on the high-fat diet increased liver fat by 35%. On the low-fat diet, insulin levels went down about 15%, and on the high-fat diet, insulin levels went up about 15%. Low-carb and ketogenic diet advocates are always talking about how you have to eat more fat, less carbs to keep your insulin levels down, but the exact opposite happens when it's actually put to the test. Even a single high-fat meal not only increases liver fat, but also insulin resistance. Within 4 hours, your whole body insulin sensitivity can drop by 25%, so your body has to pump out that much more insulin. As the accompanying editorial put it, a single fat dose packs a punch. So to help prevent or treat fatty liver disease, patients should limit or avoid eating fat-rich foods. While more long-term clinical trials are always needed, based on current evidence, we would recommend a diet low in fat, notably saturated fat, so low in meat, dairy, and junk, and low in refined carbs, notably soda. Saturated fat is not only more metabolically harmful for the human liver than unsaturated fat. Saturated fat is more harmful than straight sugar. If you overfeed people with 1,000 calories of saturated fat, like cheese and coconut oil, unsaturated fat, like nuts and olive oil, or sugar, like soda and candy, overeating 1,000 calories a day of anything isn't good for you, but the saturated fat increased liver fat 55%, significantly more than the unsaturated fats, with the candy coming in between. So in terms of weight loss, although beneficial, certain diets can actually cause or exacerbate this disease, such as a very low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet, whereas those eating healthy plant-based diets may lower the risk of fatty liver disease. For example, the consumption of legumes, beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, is associated with a lower risk of fatty liver, up to 65% lower odds eating more beans. Now, in this study, they weren't looking at people eating strictly plant-based diets, just more or less so. It's harder to study those eating completely meat-free diets, since they currently represent just a small segment of the U.S. population. But What about Americans of Indian descent? Those originating from the Indian subcontinent are one of the fastest-growing ethnic groups in the United States, and they appear to largely retain their diets, with about the same percentage of vegetarians as in India, nearly 40%. We know in India itself, non-vegetarians, those who eat meat, are at significantly higher risk of fatty liver disease. In Taiwan, you see the same thing. Vegetarians at significantly lower risk. And even the vegetarians who are affected had significantly less liver scarring. Their data suggests that replacing a single serving of soy with a serving of meat or fish was associated with 12 to 13% increased risk of fatty liver disease. OK, but what about here in the United States? Eating vegetarian was associated with being slimmer, having better blood sugars, better cholesterol, and less than half the odds of fatty liver disease. You don't know if it's cause and effect, though, until you put it to the test. In an effort to reverse a fatty liver patient's inflammatory bowel disease with a plant-based diet, liver inflammation was dramatically improved. But he also lost 9 pounds in the first 11 days thanks to eating healthy. So it's hard to tease out the specific diet effects. In fact, you have to be careful about rapid weight loss, because all that extra fat being broken down can flood into the bloodstream and sometimes make things worse. So for fatty liver disease patients, losing like 3 pounds a week might be safer. Even though plant-based diets have yet to properly be put to the test in a randomized clinical trial for fatty liver disease, I would submit that they are still the best diet for fatty liver disease, not based on a single case report, but based on the fact that cardiovascular disease is the most common cause of death among patients with fatty liver disease, not liver failure. And we do have randomized controlled trials proving that a healthy plant-based diet and lifestyle program can reverse heart disease, opening up arteries without drugs, without surgery, without stents. Yes, patients with fatty liver disease and fatty hepatitis may indeed eventually develop cirrhosis of the liver, but only if they don't die of cardiovascular diseases first. My video on kombucha was one of the first I ever did, even featured in my blog, nutritionfacts.org, the first month, where I marveled at the fact that I had reached nearly 100,000 people. Now I'm honored to say we reach more than 100,000 a day. But in that first kombucha video, I profiled a report published in the Journal of Intensive Care Medicine of a case of kombucha tea toxicity, a young guy, ending up in an acidotic coma, which concluded that while kombucha tea is considered a healthy elixir, the limited evidence currently available raises considerable concern that it may pose serious health risks. Consumption of this tea should be discouraged. It may be associated with a life-threatening lactic acidosis. This was just one of several case reports of serious and sometimes fatal liver dysfunction and lactic acidosis within close proximity of ingestion. For example, 2 cases in Iowa of severe metabolic acidosis, including 1 death, the triggering of a life-threatening autoimmune muscle disease requiring emergency surgery, probably related to kombucha, shaking, shortness of breath, and a movement disorder after consumption of tea and no other medications, xerostomia, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, headache, and neck pain, which recurred on re-ingestion of the tea. Then another case of severe metabolic lactic acidosis, a case of hepatotoxicity, liver toxicity that resulted after stopping kombucha. Why these sporadic cases? Maybe some unusual toxins developed in a particular batch? I mean, it is a fermented product, so it's possible, and just some are contaminated by some bad bug. Like the time people smeared kombucha on their skin because they were told it had magical healing power. What instead it had was anthrax growing in it, so even though such reports were rare, 10 years ago I concluded maybe we should stick to foods that haven't put people in a coma. But look, everything in life is all about risks versus benefits. Maybe it's worth it. After all, it's reputed to cure cancer, eliminate wrinkles, and even restore gray hair to its original color, marketed by alternative and naturopathic healers throughout the United States. Currently, kombucha is praised as the ultimate health drink or damned as unsafe, claimed to be a universal wonderful drug known as a purifying potion, but is it a potion or poison? Evidently, back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there were several medical studies conducted by recognized physicians confirming all sorts of beneficial effects. I couldn't wait to read them. Okay, so they cite Dufresne and Farnworth. Okay, there it is, same claim, citing Allen. Okay, what's Allen 1998? Oh, you gotta be kidding me, right? You're citing some rando kombucha website? Here it is, defunct since 2001, sourced citation list from stuff that was posted on some mailing list. Finally, in 2003, a systematic review of the clinical evidence that was published, and the main result of the systematic review was the total lack of efficacy data. No clinical studies were found, so we just have these cautionary tale case reports. And so on the basis of these data, it was concluded that the largely undetermined benefits do not outweigh the documented risks of kombucha, can therefore not be recommended. OK, but that was back in 2003. How about a 2019 systematic review of the empirical evidence of human health benefit? The non-human subjects literature claimed numerous health benefits of kombucha, meaning mice and rats, but what we need are human clinical trials, and still not a single controlled human study, but they did find one uncontrolled study showing a significant before and after reduction in fasting and after-a-meal blood sugars among type 2 diabetics. Nonetheless, despite no controlled trials, a significant commercial shelf space is now dedicated to kombucha products, and there's this widespread belief that the products promote health. So we're left with this kind of extreme disparity between science and belief, with little convincing clinical evidence, yet health claims that are as far-reaching as they are implausible, while the potential for harm seems considerable. In such extreme cases, healthcare professionals should discourage consumers from using and paying for anything that only seems to benefit those who sell it. If you go online and search for Crohn's disease in diet or ulcerative colitis in diet, the top results are a hodgepodge of conflicting advice. What does the science say? If you do a systematic review of the medical literature on dietary intake and the risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease is associated with the intake of fat and meat, whereas dietary fiber and fruits appear protective. The same foods are associated with the other major inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis. Fat and meat, with a protective association found for vegetable intake. Why? According to this meta-analysis of 9 separate studies, do meat consumers have about a 50% greater risk for inflammatory bowel disease? Well, one possibility is that meat may be a vehicle for bacteria that play a role in the development of such diseases. Meat contains huge amounts of Yersinia, for example. Yes, maybe antibiotic residues in the meat could be theoretically kind of mucking with our microbiome, but Yersinia are so-called psychotropic bacteria, meaning they're able to grow at fridge temperatures. It has been found to be significantly associated with inflammatory bowel disease, supporting this concept that Yersinia infection may be a trigger for chronic inflammatory bowel disease. One reason why specifically animal protein was associated with triple the risk of inflammatory bowel disease, but plant protein was not, is because it can lead to the formation of toxic bacterial end products, such as the rotten egg gas hydrogen sulfide, which is not just one of the main malodorous compounds in human flatus, it's a poison that's been implicated in ulcerative colitis. So go on some meat-heavy, low-carb diet, and we're not just talking about some malodorous rectal flatus, but increased risk of irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel syndrome, and eventually colorectal cancer. Hydrogen sulfide in the colon comes from sulfur-containing amino acids like methionine that are concentrated in animal proteins, though there are also sulfites added as preservatives to some non-organic wine and non-organic dried fruit. But it's the sulfur-containing amino acids that may be the more important of the two. Give people increasing quantities of meat, and you can get an exponential rise in fecal sulfides. Specific bacteria, like Biophilia wadsworthia, can take this sulfur that ends up in our colon and produce hydrogen sulfide, and give people an animal product-based diet packed with meat and eggs and dairy, and you can specifically increase the growth of this bacteria. People underestimate the dramatic effect diet can have on our gut bacteria. Give people a fecal transplant, and it can take 3 days to shift your microbiome. Take a powerful antibiotic like Cipro, and it can take a week. But start packing in the meat and eggs, and within a single day you can change your microbiome, and not for the better. You can more than double the bad bacterial machinery that churns out hydrogen sulfide, consistent with the thinking that diet-induced changes to the gut flora may contribute to the development of inflammatory bowel disease. In other words, the increase in sulfur compounds in the colon when you eat meat is not only of interest in the field of flatology, the study of human farts. One of the most common questions physicians treating patients with inflammatory bowel disease are asked is whether changing one's diet can positively affect the course of their disease. Now, traditionally, our answer had been, we have no clue. But this may now be changing, given the evidence that hydrogen sulfide may be playing a role in ulcerative colitis. And since the sulfur-containing amino acids concentrated in meat cause an increase in colonic levels of this rotten egg gas, maybe we should take off the meat. See, animal protein isn't just associated with an increased risk of getting inflammatory bowel disease in the first place, but also IBD relapses once you have the disease. This is a recent development, because the concept of IBD as a lifestyle disease mediated mainly by a westernized diet is not widely appreciated. An analysis of diet in the follow-up period after diagnosis in relation to a relapse of inflammatory bowel disease had been ignored, but not any longer. Ulcerative colitis patients in remission and their diets were followed for a year to see which foods were linked to the bloody diarrhea coming raging back, and the strongest relationship between a dietary factor and an increased risk of relapse observed in this study was for a high intake of meat. So, what if you have people lower their sulfur-containing amino acid intake by decreasing their consumption of animal products? They tried it on 4 ulcerative colitis patients, and without any change in meds, they experienced like a 4-fold improvement in their loose stools. In fact, they felt so much better, they didn't think it ethical to try switching them back. Since sulfur-containing amino acids are the primary source of dietary sulfur, a low-sulfur diet essentially means a shift from a typical diet high in animal protein and fat and low in fiber to more of a plant-based diet. Westernized diets are pro-inflammatory, and plant-based diets are anti-inflammatory. Let's see what treatment with a plant-based diet can do after the onset of ulcerative colitis during a low-carbohydrate weight loss diet. A 36-year-old man lost 13 pounds on a low-carb diet, but also lost his health, diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. Put him on a diet centered around whole plant foods, though, and poof, symptoms resolved without medication. OK, but this is just one case. Case reports are like glorified anecdotes. Right? The value of case reports lies in their ability to inspire researchers to put it to the test, and that's exactly what they did. There had never been a study published focusing on using plant-based diets for the treatment of ulcerative colitis until now. Considering the lack of a suitable diet to be the biggest issue faced in the current treatment of inflammatory bowel disease, and regarding it as a lifestyle disease caused mainly by our omnivorous diet, a group of Japanese gastroenterologists have been providing a plant-based diet to all patients with IBD for over a decade, and publishing extraordinary results, far better than have to date been reported in the medical literature. I profiled some of their early work in one of my first videos that went up on nutritionfacts.org, found to be effective in the maintenance of remission in Crohn's disease by 100% at 1 year, 90% at 2 years. So how about a plant-based diet for relapse prevention in ulcerative colitis? Educational hospitalization meant bringing patients into the hospital to control their diet and educate them about the benefits of plant-based eating so they'd be more motivated to continue it at home. Most patients, about 3/4, experienced improvements such as disappearance or decrease in bloody stool during hospitalization. Fantastic. OK, but here's the really exciting part. Then they followed the patients for 5 years, and 81% were able to remain in remission the whole time, and 98% were able to keep the disease at bay for at least a year. That blows other treatments away. Those relapse rates are far lower than those reported with medication. Under conventional treatment, other studies found that about half relapse, compared to only 2% among those taught to eat healthier. A plant-based diet was previously shown to be effective in both the active and quiescent stages of Crohn's disease. The current study has shown that a plant-based diet is effective in both the active and quiescent stages of ulcerative colitis as well. And so they did another study on even more severely affected cases with active disease and found the same thing, far beating out conventional drug therapy. People felt so much better, they were still eating more plant-based even 6 years later. The researchers conclude that a plant-based diet is effective for treating ulcerative colitis to prevent a relapse. Why? Well, plant-based diets are rich in fiber, which feeds our good gut bugs. That may partly explain why a plant-based diet prevents a variety of chronic diseases. And so that's what we may be seeing with inflammatory bowel disease, suggesting that replacing an omnivorous diet with a plant-based diet is the right approach. It's like using plant-based diets to treat the cause of heart disease, our #1 killer, not just safer and cheaper, but works better. No adverse side effects noted for plant-based eating. Let's compare that to the side effects of immunosuppressants used for ulcerative colitis like cyclosporin. Side effects include... And now we have even fancier drugs that cost about $60,000 a year. That's $5,000 a month. And they don't even work very well, with clinical remission at 1 year of only like 17 to 34%. And instead of no adverse side effects, they can give you a stroke. They can give you heart failure. They can even give you cancer, including a rare type of cancer that often results in death. Or how about a serious brain disease known as progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, which can kill you and for which there is no known treatment or cure? Yeah, increased risk of death, but did we mention how nice and small the pill was and the easy-to-open bottle? Important to our understanding and prevention of the global increase in inflammatory bowel disease, we know that dietary fiber appears to reduce risk, whereas dietary fat, animal protein, and sugar may increase risk. Despite the recognition of the westernization of lifestyle as a major driver of the growing incidence of inflammatory bowel disease, no countermeasures against such lifestyle changes have been recommended, except that patients with Crohn's disease shouldn't smoke. Look, we know consuming whole plant-based foods is synonymous with an anti-inflammatory diet. Here's a list of foods with inflammatory effects. Here's a list of foods with anti-inflammatory effects. So how about putting a plant-based diet to the test? Just cutting down on red and processed meat didn't work, but what about cutting down on all meat? 25-year-old guy diagnosed with Crohn's disease but failed to enter clinical remission despite standard medical therapy. But after switching to a diet based exclusively on grains, legumes like beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, vegetables, and fruits, he entered clinical remission without the need for medication and showed no signs of Crohn's disease on follow-up colonoscopy. It's worth delving into some of the details. The conventional treatment they started him on is infliximab, sold as Remicade, which can cause a stroke and may increase your chances of getting lymphoma and other cancers, but it's a bargain for only $35,000 a year. And it may not even work in 35 to 40% of patients, and that seemed to be the case here. So they upped the dose. After 37 weeks and still suffering after 2 years on the drug, until he tried completely eliminating animal products and processed foods from his diet, finally experiencing a complete resolution of his symptoms. Prior to this, his diet had been a typical American diet, but having experienced complete clinical remission for the first time since his diagnosis, he decided to switch to a whole food plant-based diet permanently, severely reducing his intake of processed food and limiting animal products to 1 serving or less per week. And whenever his diet started to slip, symptoms started coming back, but he could always wipe them out by eating healthier. After 6 months of implementing these changes in diet and lifestyle, including stress relief and exercise, a follow-up demonstrated complete mucosal healing of the gut lining with no visible evidence of Crohn's disease. We know a diet consisting of whole grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables is shown to be helpful in the prevention and treatment of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, gallbladder disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and many cancers. Although further research is required, this case report suggests that Crohn's disease might be added to this list of conditions, but that further research has already been done. About 20 patients with Crohn's disease were placed on a semi-vegetarian diet, meaning no more than a half serving of fish once a week and a half serving of meat once every 2 weeks, and achieved a 100% remission rate at 1 year and 90% at 2 years. Some strayed from the diet, though. Let's see what happened to them. After a year, half had relapsed, and at year 2, only 20% remained in remission. But those that stuck with it had remarkable success. It was a small study with no formal control group, but represents the best reported result in Crohn's relapse prevention published in the medical literature to date. Nowadays, Crohn's patients are often treated with so-called biologic drugs, expensive injected antibodies that suppress your immune system and have effectively induced and maintained remission in Crohn's disease, but not in everyone. Current remission rate in Crohn's with early use of Remicade, 64%. So 30 to 40% of patients are likely to experience a disabling disease course even after treatment. So what about adding a plant-based diet? Remission rates jumped up to 100% for those who didn't have to drop out due to drug side effects. Even if you exclude the milder cases, 100% of those with serious, even severe fulminant disease achieved remission. But if you look at gold standard systematic reviews, they conclude that the effects of dietary interventions on inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis are uncertain. This is because only randomized controlled trials were considered. Totally understandable, as that's the most rigorous study design. Nevertheless, people with inflammatory bowel disease deserve advice based on the best available evidence rather than no advice at all. And switching to a plant-based diet has been shown to achieve far better outcomes than those reported on conventional treatments in both active and quiescent stages in both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. For example, here's 1-year remission rates in Crohn's disease, 100%, compared to budesonide, an immunosuppressant corticosteroid drug, a half-elemental diet, meaning like at-home tube feedings, the $35,000 a year Remicade, or the $75,000 a year drug Humira. Safer, cheaper, and more effective? Maybe we should recommend plant-based diets for inflammatory bowel disease. It would seem clear that treatment based on treating the cause of the disease is optimal. Spreading the word about healthier diets could help halt the scourge of inflammatory bowel, but how are people going to hear about this amazing research without some kind of public education campaign? That's what nutritionfacts.org is all about. There is now overwhelming evidence to support reducing LDL cholesterol, bad cholesterol, to reduce atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, the #1 killer of men and women. So why is adherence to cholesterol-lowering statin drug therapy such a major challenge? The majority of studies reported at least 40%, and as much as 80% of patients did not comply fully with statin treatment recommendations. 3/4 may flat-out stop taking them, or sometimes up to nearly 90% discontinue treatment. When asked why, most former statin users, or discontinuers, cited muscle pain, a side effect, as the primary reason for stopping the pills. By far, the most prevalent and important adverse events, up to 72% of all statin side effects, are statin-associated muscle symptoms. Taking coenzyme Q10 supplements as a treatment for statin-associated muscle symptoms was a good idea in theory, but they don't actually appear to help. Normally, side effect symptoms go away when you stop the drug, but sometimes can linger a year or more. There's evidently growing evidence that statin intolerance is predominantly psychosocial, not pharmacological, meaning, wait, maybe it's mostly just in people's heads? Statins have developed a bad reputation with the public, one editorial read, a phenomenon driven largely by proliferation on the internet of bizarre and unscientific criticisms of these drugs. Maybe it's Google that leads to statin intolerance. But come on, people have been going off statins for decades before there even was an internet. What kind of data has doctors suggesting that patients are falsely misattributing normal aches and pains to be statin side effects. Well, if you take people who claim to have statin-related muscle pain and randomize them back and forth between statins and an identical-looking placebo in 3-week blocks, they can't actually tell whether they're getting the real drug or the sugar pill. The problem with that study, though, is that it may take months to not only develop statin-induced muscle pain, but months before it goes away. So no wonder 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off may not be long enough for the participants to discern which is which. But these data are more convincing. 10,000 people were randomized to a statin or sugar pill for a few years, but they had to stop the study early because so many more people were dying in the sugar pill group, and so everyone was then offered the statin. And what they noted was that there was no excess of reports of muscle-related adverse effects among patients assigned to the statin over those assigned to the placebo, but then when the placebo phase was over, and the people knew they were on a statin, then they reported more muscle side effects than those who knew they weren't. These results illustrate the so-called nocebo effect, kind of like the opposite of the placebo effect. Placebo effects are positive consequences falsely attributed to a treatment, whereas nocebo effects are negative consequences falsely attributed to a treatment, as was evidently seen here, as there was an excess rate of muscle-related adverse effects reported only when patients and their doctors were aware that statin therapy was being used, and not when it was being concealed. They hope these results will help assure both physicians and patients that most adverse events associated with statins are not actually caused by the drug, and should help counter exaggerated claims about statin-related side effects. It's these kind of results from placebo-controlled randomized trials that are said to have shown definitively that almost all the symptomatic adverse events that are attributed to statin therapy in routine practice are not actually caused by the drug. Now, only a few patients will believe this, that their statin-associated muscle symptoms are of psychogenic origin, meaning all just in their head, but their denial may have deadly consequences. Discontinuing statin treatment may be a life-threatening mistake. Here's the mortality of those who stopped their statins after having a possible adverse reaction compared to those who stuck with them. This translates into about 1 excess death for every 83 patients who discontinued treatment within a 4-year period. So when there are media reports about statin side effects and people stop taking them, this could result in thousands of fatal and disabling heart attacks and strokes, which would otherwise have been avoided. Seldom in the history of modern therapeutics have the substantial proven benefits of a treatment been compromised to such an extent by serious misrepresentations of the evidence for its safety. But is it a misrepresentation to suggest statin therapy causes side effects in up to a fifth of patients? That is actually what you see in clinical practice. Between 10% to 25% of patients placed on statins complain of muscle problems. But because we don't see anywhere near those kinds of numbers in controlled trials, patients are accused of being confused. Why in clinical trials is the incidence of side effects from statins so low, but out in the real world appear to be so high? For example, take this meta-analysis of clinical trials, finding muscle problems not in 1 in 5, but only 1 in 2,000 patients. So, hey, maybe everyone over a certain age should be on them. But of course, every single one of those trials was funded by the statin manufacturers themselves. So for example, how could the randomized controlled trials miss detecting statin-related adverse side effects such as muscle pain? By not asking. A review of 44 statin trials revealed that only 1 directly asked about muscle-related adverse effects. So are the vast majority of side effects just being missed in all these trials, or are the vast majority of side effects seen in clinical practice just some figment of patients' imagination? Bottom line, we don't know, but there's certainly an urgent need to figure it out. In a 1932 article in Popular Mechanics entitled 50 Years Hence, Winston Churchill predicted that we would one day escape the absurdity, the inefficiency of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing just the parts we need. Indeed, growing meat straight from muscle cells could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 96%, lower water use as much as 96%, and lower land use by as much as 99%. If we are to avoid dangerous climate change by the middle of the century, global meat consumption simply cannot continue to rise at the current rate. And there's certainly been initiatives like Meatless Mondays to try to get people to cut down, but so far they do not appear to be contributing in any significant way to the translation of the idea of eating less meat into the mainstream. So, in light of people's continued desire to eat meat, it seems the problems associated with consumption are unlikely to be fully resolved by changing people's attitudes, so instead, maybe we should try changing the product. From an environmental standpoint, it seems like a slam dunk. From an animal welfare standpoint, it could get rid of factory farms and slaughterhouses for good, and I wouldn't have to stumble across articles like this in the scientific literature. I mean, what more do you need to know about modern animal agriculture than the fact so-called ag-gag laws have been proposed and passed across the country, banning undercover photos inside such operations to keep us all in the dark. Okay, but what about the human health implications of cultivated meat? I mean, I get the animal welfare, environment, food security benefits, but what about the potential for cultivated meat to have health and safety benefits to individual consumers? Nutritionally, the most important advantage is being able to swap out the type of fat, since right now they're just growing straight muscle tissue, so you could marble it with something less harmful than animal fat. Of course, you're still stuck with the animal protein. In terms of health, the biggest, clearest advantage is food safety, reducing the risk of foodborne pathogens. There's been a six-fold increase in food poisoning over the last few decades. We're talking tens of millions sickened annually by infected food in the United States alone, including hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations and thousands of annual deaths. And contaminated meats and animal products are the most common cause. When the cultivated meat industry calls its products clean meat, that's not just a nod to clean energy, where food poisoning pathogens like E. coli, Campylobacter, and Salmonella are fecal bacteria. They are a result of fecal contamination. They're intestinal bugs, and so you don't have to worry about them if you're making meat without the intestines. Yes, there are all sorts of methods to remove visible fecal contamination in slaughterhouses these days, and even experimental imaging technologies designed to detect more kind of diluted fecal contaminations, but we're still left at the retail level with about 10% of chicken contaminated with Salmonella, 40% of retail chicken contamination with Campylobacter, and most poultry, and about half of retail ground beef and pork chops contaminated with E. coli, an indicator of fecal residue. We don't have to cook the crap out of cultivated meat because there isn't any crap to begin with. Cultivating muscle meat straight from cells instead of carving it from animals would reduce the risk of foodborne illnesses now due to fecal contamination during slaughtering and the evisceration of carcasses, because there would be no feces, would be no slaughter, and no carcasses to eviscerate. In addition, it would also reduce the threat from antibiotic resistance. So to compensate for the overcrowded, stressful, unhygienic conditions on factory farms, the animals are dosed in mass with antibiotics, lots of antibiotics. We're talking 20 million pounds a year of medically important antibiotics. So we give farm animals in the United States 2 million pounds of penicillin drugs, 15 million pounds of tetracyclines. I mean, this is madness. Right? It gets laced right into their feed and water. We're talking antibiotics, important to human medicine, being fed to cows, pigs, and chickens by the ton, by the thousands of tons laced into their feed and water. And that's all without a prescription. 97% of the tens of millions of pounds of antibiotics given to farm animals in the United States are bought over the counter, as in without a prescription or order from a veterinarian. I mean, to even get a few milligrams of penicillin, you need a doctor's prescription, right? Because look, these are miracle wonder drugs that can't be squandered. But meanwhile, farmers can just back their trucks right up to the feed store. And now, half the salmonella in retail meat, chicken, turkey, beef, pork, is resistant to tetracycline. About a quarter of the bugs are now resistant to 3 or more entire classes of antibiotics, including some resistant to ceftriaxone, which is a critically important drug we use to treat severe salmonella infections, especially in children. Such agricultural applications for antimicrobials are now considered an urgent threat to human health, with the link between antibiotic use in animals and antibiotic resistance in humans considered unequivocal. It all starts in the poop. Antibiotic-resistant bugs are selected for and then can spread via the meat or produce contaminated by the poop, or in the wind, air, the water, carried by insects. Lots of pathways by which resistant superbugs can escape. So even if you don't eat meat, you can be put at risk by the pathogens released from stressed, immunocompromised, contaminant-filled livestock pumped with antibiotics. That's one of the reasons the American Public Health Association has called for a moratorium on factory farms, all the pollution of the surrounding communities. More than 5 tons of animal manure are produced for every man, woman, and child in the United States every year. It all starts with the poop. But cultivated meat means no guts, no poop, no fecal infections, no antibiotics necessary, and no fecal or antibiotic residues left in the meat, which could potentially cause a variety of side effects beyond just the transfer of antibiotic-resistant bacteria to humans. And things are getting worse, not better. U.S. animal agriculture is using more antibiotics now than ever before. And it's not just because we're raising more animals. Antibiotic sales in the U.S. are outpacing meat production. Yes, meat production is going up, but check out the rise in antibiotic sales for meat production. With the combined might of big ag and big pharma, who profits from the selling all those drugs, it's hard to imagine anything changing on the political side. Maybe the only hope is the change on the production side. The unstoppable rise of super-resistant strains of bacteria is a serious worldwide problem, resulting in 700,000 deaths every year. And the projections for global antibiotic use in food animal production are ominous, perhaps exceeding 100,000 tons of antibiotics pumped into animals for food by 2030. Quite simply, we may be on the path to untreatable infections by using even some of our last resort antibiotics like carbapenems just to shave off a few cents off a pound of meat. And it's not just foodborne bacteria. There's mad cow, swine flu, bird flu, with the potential to kill millions of people. Skeptical? I've got a book for you to read, whose author's superb storytelling ability evidently makes it a must-read. Given the threat of the chickens coming home to roost, an editorial in the American Journal of Public Health thought it curious that ceasing to eat them, or at the very least radically limiting the quantity of them that is eaten, is largely off the radar as a significant preventive measure to prevent the next influenza pandemic. Yet humanity does not even seem to consider this option. But humanity need not consider that option, because you could make all the chicken you want without guts or lungs. By cultivating muscle meat directly without associated organs like intestines, the incidence of foodborne diseases could be significantly reduced, as well as exposure to any antibiotics, pesticides, arsenic, dioxins, and hormones associated with conventionally grown meat. Currently, 7 hormone drugs are approved by the FDA to bulk up the production of milk and meat. In the European Union, there exists a total ban on such use, but even without injected hormones, animal products naturally have hormones because they come from animals. Eggs, for example, contribute more to the dietary intake of estrogens than beef, whether the animal is treated with extra hormones or not. After all, eggs come straight from the hen's ovaries. Of course they're swimming with hormones. But if you're just growing the muscle meat or egg white protein directly, you don't need to include reproductive organs or adrenal glands or any of the associated hormones. Chemical safety is another concern for meat produced under current production systems. There are chemical toxicants and industrial pollutants that build up in the food chain, such as pesticides, PCBs, heavy metals, flame retardants. But with cultivated meat, there is no food chain, right? You could grow all the tuna you wanted with zero mercury. When the World Health Organization determined that processed meat was a known human carcinogen and unprocessed meat a probable human carcinogen, they weren't even talking about the carcinogenic environmental pollutants. When researchers tested retail meat for the presence of 33 chemicals with calculated carcinogenic potential, like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or organochlorine pesticides like DDT and dioxin like PCBs, they concluded that in order to reduce the risk of cancer, it was suggested limiting ingestion of beef, pork, or chicken to a maximum of 5 servings a month. Why cultivate meat from scratch when you can just buy organic? Because surprisingly, the consumption of organic meat does not diminish the carcinogenic potential associated with the intake of these industrial pollutants. In recent years, a number of surprising studies have compared the presence of environmental contaminants in organic versus conventional meat, and organic was sometimes more contaminated, and not just beef. Higher levels found in pork and poultry, too. If you look at the micropollutants and chemical residues in organic and conventional meat, several environmental contaminants, dioxins, PCBs, lead, arsenic, were measured at significantly higher levels in the organic samples. The green is organic, the blue conventional, though cooking helps to draw off some of the fat where the PCBs are concentrated. Seafood seems to be the exception, though, with steaming, for example, generally increasing contaminant levels, increasing contaminant exposure, concentrating mercury levels as much as 47%, so better to not have toxic buildup in the first place. Yes, over 95% of human exposure to industrial pollutants like dioxins and PCBs comes from foods like meat, fatty fish, and dairy. But it doesn't just appear there magically, right? The only way that chicken, fish, and other meat leads to human exposure is because they build up a lifetime of exposure in our polluted world, from incinerators and power plants and sewer sludge and on, right? Unlike conventional meat production, right, a slaughter-free harvest would not just mean no infected animals, but no contaminated animals, right? Pollutant-wise, it'd be like taking a time machine back before the Industrial Revolution. The CDC recommends everyone over the age of 6 months get a routine annual flu shot every year, unless you have some sort of contraindication, such as an allergy to any of the components. They recommend trying to get it by the end of October, but may be beneficial even in December or later. How effective are flu vaccines? Well, it depends on the year, but typically it reduces the risk of getting the flu by about 40 to 50%. So in healthy adults, we can say with moderate certainty, we can decrease the risk of getting it from 2% each year down to just under 1%. Among older adults, you may get a similar relative risk reduction, but the baseline risk is higher and the consequences greater, so the absolute benefits are greater too. In kids, flu vaccines really shine a high certainty of evidence of a substantial drop in risk, but even in this kind of best-case scenario with vaccination, there's still a risk. So what else can we do? Each year, Americans experience millions of cases of influenza and hundreds of millions of colds. What about elderberry supplements? In a test tube, elderberry extracts can inhibit pathogens, including the flu virus, and in a petri dish it can rev up the production of flu-fighting molecules from human immune system cells, like tumor necrosis factor, as much as nearly 45-fold, and elderberry juice can help mice fight off the flu. But what about actual people? The first clinical trial was published back in the 90s, a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial to treat flu-like symptoms, and odds for improvement before the 5th day in the treated group were more than 20 times the odds in the control group. 2 subsequent double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials showed similar accelerated healing in the elderberry groups. This is the study I was excited to see: elderberry supplementation for cold symptoms in air travelers. Given my 200 City Book Tour, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial of 312 economy-class passengers. And while taking elderberry didn't seem to prevent people from coming down with cold symptoms, the duration and severity of symptoms in those that did get a cold seemed to have been lessened, suffering on average about 5 days instead of 7. A similar study using the herb echinacea found a lessening of symptom scores that was of only borderline statistical significance. But if you compile all such studies together, even though most of the individual trials didn't find statistically significant improvements, put them together, and there may be about a 20% decreased cold incidence, though there is a concern about selective reporting and publication bias, meaning a bunch of findings and entire studies seemed to be MIA, suggesting maybe negative studies were quietly shelved. So really not sure about echinacea, but all the elderberry studies seem to have positive results, suggesting elderberry supplementation provides an effective treatment option when more serious treatment isn't needed. This conclusion came from someone with apparent conflicts of interest, though. In fact, each of the 4 elderberry studies were funded by the elderberry product companies themselves. Any other berries that might help? A randomized, placebo-controlled interventional study funded, predictably, by Ocean Spray found that the gamma-delta T cells of those drinking a low-calorie cranberry juice beverage for 10 weeks appear to be proliferating at nearly 5-fold the rate. These immune cells serve as like our first line of defense, though they didn't get fewer colds, but they did seem to suffer less, but not enough to actually prevent days missed from work or an impairment of their activities. But at least, cranberries have never been reported to cause pancreatitis. Some guy taking elderberry extract not only suffered an attack of acute pancreatitis, a sudden painful inflammation of the pancreas, it went away when he stopped it and then reappeared again years later when he started taking it again, which suggests a cause and effect. Why take elderberry extracts, though, when you could just eat the elderberries themselves? Well, cooked are fine, but consuming raw elderberries can cause you to puke your guts out. Oh, now you tell me. I found out the hard way, as I explained in an answer to the question, what was the worst day of my life, in my How Not to Die London Real interview. It turns out elderberry fruit form cyanide, such that 8 people had to be medevaced out after someone brought freshly squeezed elderberry juice to a gathering. Adequate dietary iodine is required for normal thyroid function. In fact, the 2 thyroid hormones are named after how many iodine atoms they contain, T3 and T4. Now, given that iodine is extensively stored in the thyroid gland itself, it's not something you have to get every day, but your overall diet needs to have some good source. Unfortunately, the common sources aren't particularly health-promoting. Iodized salt, dairy foods, because iodine-based cleansers like betadine are used to sanitize the udders, which results in some iodine leaching into the milk. They also add iodine to cattle feed. Some commercial breads have iodine-containing food additives. So if you put people on a paleo-type diet and cut out dairy and table salt, they can develop an iodine deficiency, even though they double their seafood intake, which can also be a source. What about those switching to diets centered around whole plant foods? I mean, they're also cutting down on ice cream and Wonder Bread, and if they're not eating anything from the sea, seaweed, sea vegetables, they can run into the same problem. Her parents reported striving to feed her only the healthiest foods. The 3-year-old only got plant-based, unsalted, unprocessed foods with no vitamin supplementation. Now, that could have been deadly. I mean, with no vitamin B12, those on strictly plant-based diets can develop irreversible nerve damage. But in this case, a goiter arose first due to inadequate iodine intake. Here's another case of veganism as a cause of iodine-deficient hypothyroidism in a toddler after weaning. Now, before weaning, he was fine because his mother kept taking her prenatal vitamins, which luckily contained iodine. Most vegetarians and vegans are apparently unaware of the importance of iodine in pregnancy, just as clueless as their omnivorous counterparts. The American Thyroid Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics have recommended that women even just planning on getting pregnant should ingest a daily supplement that contains 150 micrograms of iodine, yet only 60% of prenatal vitamins marketed in the U.S. contain this essential mineral. So, in spite of the recommendations, about 40% lack it. Therefore, it's extremely important that pregnant and breastfeeding women read the labels to ensure they are receiving an adequate amount. Women of reproductive age have an average iodine level of 110, which is fine for non-pregnant individuals, but we'd really like to see at least 150 in pregnancy. It's basically a 24-hour urine test in which iodine sufficiency is defined as 100 micrograms per liter of pee in non-pregnant adults, which your average vegan fails to reach in the largest study done to date out of Boston. The recommended average daily intake is 150 micrograms a day for most people, which you can get in like a cup and a half of cow's milk. Sadly, plant-based milks are typically not fortified with iodine, averaging only about 3 micrograms per cup. In the largest systematic study to date, although many plant-based milks are fortified with calcium, they only found just 3 of 47 fortified with iodine. Those that were had as much as cow's milk, but those that weren't fell short. Plant-based milk companies brag about enriching their milks with calcium and often vitamin B12, D, vitamin A, but only rarely are attempts made to match the iodine content. The only reason cow's milk has as much as it does is because they enrich the feed, or it comes dripping off their udders, right? So why don't plant milk companies add iodine too? Right? I was told by a food scientist at Silk that my carrageenan video played a role in them switching to another thickener. Hopefully they'll see this video and consider adding iodine too, or some company will snatch at the market advantage opportunity. The researchers conclude that individuals who consume plant-based milks not fortified with iodine may be at risk for iodine deficiency unless they consume alternative dietary iodine sources, the healthiest of which is sea vegetables, which we'll cover next. Dairy milk supplies between a quarter and a half of the daily iodine requirement in the United States, though milk itself has little native iodine. The milk iodine content is mainly determined by factors like the application of iodine-containing teat disinfectants. The iodine residues in milk appear to originate mainly from the contamination of the teat surface. The teats are sprayed or dipped with betadine-type disinfectants, and the iodine just kind of leaches into the milk. Too bad most of the plant-based milks on the market aren't enriched with iodine too. Fortified soy milk is probably the healthiest of the plant milks, but even if it was enriched with iodine, what about the effects of soy on thyroid function? It's funny, when I searched the medical literature on soy and thyroid, this study popped up: a cost-effective way to train residents to do thyroid biopsies. Just stick the ultrasound probe right on top and go to town. It turns out, on ultrasound, your thyroid gland looks a lot like tofu. Anyways, the idea that soy may influence thyroid function originated over 8 decades ago, when marked thyroid enlargement was seen in rats fed raw soybeans, though the observation that people living in Asian countries have consumed soy foods for centuries with no perceptible thyrotoxic effects certainly suggests their safety. Bottom line, there's not seemed to be a problem with people who have normal thyroid function. However, soy foods may inhibit the oral absorption of Synthroid, thyroid hormone replacement drugs, but so do all foods. Right? That's why we tell patients to take it on an empty stomach. But you also have to be getting enough iodine, so it may be particularly important for soy food consumers to make sure their intake of iodine is adequate. What's the best way to get iodine? For those who use table salt, make sure it's iodized. Currently, only half of table salt sold contains iodine, and the salt used in processed foods is typically not iodized. Of course, ideally, we shouldn't add salt at all. Dietary salt is a public health hazard. I think this title is a little over the top. Dietary salt is the #1 dietary risk factor for death on the planet Earth, wiping out more than 3 million people a year, twice as bad as not eating your vegetables. What's the best source of iodine then? Sea vegetables. Right? You can get a little iodine here and there from a whole variety of foods, but the most concentrated source by far, with up to nearly 2,000% of your daily allowance in just a single gram, which is like the weight of a paperclip, seaweed. Given that iodine is extensively stored in the thyroid, it can be safely consumed intermittently, meaning you don't have to get it every day, which makes seaweed use in a range of foods attractive and occasional seaweed intake enough to ensure iodine sufficiency. However, some seaweed should be used with caution due to its overly high iodine content, like kelp. Too much iodine can cause hyperthyroidism, a hyperactive thyroid gland. A woman presented with a racing heartbeat, insomnia, anxiety, and weight loss, thanks to taking just 2 tablets a day containing kelp. In my last video, I noted how the average urinary iodine level of vegans was less than the ideal levels, but there was one kelp-eating vegan with a urinary concentration over 9,000. Right? Adequate intake is when you're peeing out 100 to 199. Excessive iodine intake is when you break 300. 9,437, way too much. The recommended average daily intake is 150 micrograms a day for non-pregnant, non-breastfeeding adults. We may want to stay below 600 on a day-to-day basis, whereas a tablespoon of kelp may contain 2,000. Right? I'd stay away from kelp because it has too much, and stay away from hijiki because it contains too much arsenic. Here's how much of common seaweed preparation should give you an approximate daily allowance. 2 nori sheets, you can literally just nibble on them as snacks like I do. 1 teaspoon of dulse flakes, which you can just sprinkle on anything. 1 teaspoon of dried aramay, which is great for adding to soups. Or 1 tablespoon of seaweed salad. If iodine is concentrated in marine foods, this raises the question of how early hominins living in continental areas could have met their iodine requirements. Well, here's what bonobos do, perhaps our closest relatives. During swamp visits, they all forage aquatic herbs. There are several autoimmune diseases that affect the thyroid gland, the most common being Graves' disease and Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Graves' disease results in hyperthyroidism, an overactive thyroid gland. Though slaughterhouses are supposed to remove thyroid glands, should some neck meat slip in, you can suffer a similar syndrome called hamburger thyrotoxicosis, but that's not from your body making too much thyroid hormone, that's from your body eating too much thyroid hormone. Graves' disease is much more common, and meat-free diets may be able to help with both, as plant-based diets may be associated with a low prevalence of autoimmune disease in general, as observed, for example, in rural sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe it's because plants are packed with antioxidants, which are possible protective factors against autoimmune diseases. Maybe it's because plants are packed with anti-inflammatory compounds. After all, a whole food plant-based diet is basically synonymous with an anti-inflammatory diet. But you don't know until you put it to the test. It turns out the exclusion of all animal foods was associated with half the prevalence of hyperthyroidism compared with omnivorous diets. Lacto-ovo-vegetarian and fish-only diets were associated with intermediate protection, but a 52% lower odds of hyperthyroidism among those eating strictly plant-based diets. This apparent protection may be due to the exclusion of animal foods, the benefits of plant foods, or both. Right? Animal foods, like meat, eggs, and dairy products, may contain high estrogen concentrations, for example, which have been linked to autoimmunity in preclinical studies, or the decrease in animal protein may downregulate IGF-1, which is not just a cancer-promoting growth hormone, but may play a role in autoimmune diseases as well. Or it could be the good stuff in plants that may protect cells, like the polyphenol phytochemicals, such as flavonoids found in plant foods. Maybe it's the environmental toxins that build up the food chain. For example, fish contaminated with industrial pollutants like PCBs are associated with increased frequency of thyroid disorders. OK, what about the other autoimmune thyroid disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which, assuming you're getting enough iodine, is the primary cause of hypothyroidism, an underactive thyroid gland. Graves' disease wasn't the only autoimmune disorder that was rare or virtually unknown among those living in rural sub-Saharan Africa eating near-vegan diets. They also appeared to have less Hashimoto's. There's evidence that those with Hashimoto's have compromised antioxidant status, but we don't know if it's cause or effect. But if you look at the dietary factors associated with blood levels of autoimmune antithyroid antibodies, animal fats seem to be associated with higher levels, whereas vegetables and other plant foods are associated with lower levels. So again, anti-inflammatory diets may be useful. No surprise, as Hashimoto's is an inflammatory disease. That's what thyroiditis means, inflammation of the thyroid gland. Another possibility is the reduction in methionine intake, an amino acid concentrated in animal protein, thought to be one reason why the consumption of whole plant foods is likely to have a favorable influence on longevity, through decreasing the risk of cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And methionine restriction improves thyroid function in mice, but has yet to be put to the test for Hashimoto's in humans. If you compare the poop of patients with Hashimoto's to controls, the condition appears to be related to a clear reduction in the concentration of Prevotella species. Prevotella are good fiber-eating bugs known to enhance anti-inflammatory activities. Decreased Prevotella levels are also something you see in other autoimmune conditions, such as multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes. How do you get more Prevotella? Eat more plants. But put a vegetarian on a diet of meat, eggs, and dairy, and within as few as 4 days, you can drive down levels. So one would expect those eating plant-based diets to have less Hashimoto's, but in a previous video I expressed concern about insufficient iodine intake, which could also lead to hypothyroidism. So which is it? Let's find out. Vegan diets tended to be associated with lower, not higher, risk of hypothyroid disease. Why the word tended? Because the associated protection against hypothyroidism incidence and prevalence studies did not reach statistical significance. It wasn't just because they were slimmer, the lower risk existed even after controlling for body weight, so they think maybe it's because animal products may induce inflammation. The question I have, though, is if someone who already has Hashimoto's, what happens if you change their diet? That's exactly what I'll explore next. Autoimmune thyroiditis, also known as Hashimoto's disease, is an organ-specific autoimmune disorder where your body attacks your own thyroid gland, often leading to hypothyroidism due to destruction and scarring of the gland itself. We know there's a genetic component, since identical twins are more likely to share the disease than fraternal twins. However, even with identical twins, the concordance rate was only about 50%, meaning even if your identical twin with basically the exact same DNA as you has the disease, there's only like a flip of a coin's chance you'll get it, emphasizing that other important factors other than your genes play a role in the development of the disease. Genes load the gun, but environment may pull the trigger. More than 90 chemicals have been noted disrupting hormonal balance or thyroid function. However, only a few such pollutants show evidence that they contribute to autoimmune thyroid disease. These include polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which smokers get a lot from their cigarettes, but in non-smokers, exposure comes almost entirely from food. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are primarily formed when muscle meats, such as beef, and pork, fish, or chicken, are cooked by high-temperature methods such as grilling. PBBs are a type of flame-retardant chemical no longer manufactured in the U.S., but still found in the aquatic food chain, and PCBs are used in a number of industrial processes and end up in people's bodies, largely through the consumption of fish as well, but also other meat and eggs. So one might suspect those eating plant-based diets would have lower rates of hypothyroidism, and indeed, despite their lower iodine intake, vegan diets tended to be protective, but they've never been put to the test in an interventional trial. A modification of the Paleolithic diet has been tried in Hashimoto's patients, but didn't appear to improve thyroid function. What did, though, was Nigella sativa. That name should sound familiar to anyone who's read my latest book, How Not to Diet, or watched my latest live presentation, Evidence-Based Weight Loss. Nigella sativa is the sciencey name for black cumin, which is just a simple spice, but it's also used for a variety of medicinal purposes. In this study, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of 8 weeks of a half teaspoon of powdered black cumin a day in Hashimoto's patients, not only was there a significant reduction in body weight, which is why I profiled it in the book, it also significantly reduced thyroid-stimulating hormone, a sign that thyroid function was improving, and even lowered the level of autoimmune antithyroid antibodies, as well as increasing blood levels of thyroid hormone T3 in these Hashimoto's patients. In addition, there was a significant drop in interleukin-23, a pro-inflammatory cell signal thought to help promote the autoimmune inflammation of the thyroid, so further confirming the anti-inflammatory nature of the plant. And what were the side effects? Well, a 17% drop in LDL bad cholesterol. And given the fact that patients with Hashimoto's may be at particularly high risk of developing heart disease, well, this is exactly the kind of side effect we'd want. Considering these health-promoting effects of black cumin, it can be considered as a therapeutic approach in the management of Hashimoto's-related metabolic abnormalities. A similar trial failed to find a benefit, though, same dose, same time frame, but no significant changes in thyroid function. In contrast with the last study, though, they were not all Hashimoto's patients, but rather hypothyroid for any reason, and that may have diluted the results. And it's possible that telling patients to take the black cumin doses with their thyroid hormone replacement therapy may have interfered with its absorption, similar to other foods and drugs, which is why patients are normally told to take it on an empty stomach. Since there are no downsides, it's just a simple spice, I figure, hey, why not give it a try? The worst that can happen is you'll have tastier food.